What's going on, guys? It's Luminostic, and welcome to Psychedelic Mysteries History, the history of psychedelic mysteries, or something to that effect. We're also going to be looking forward. I feel like I've kind of neglected the subject of psychedelic medicine, psychedelic philosophy, and the relationship between psychedelics and the occult and consciousness for a little while on this channel because there has been a lot of other stuff on my mind. But today I was putting together a video series on psychedelic luminaries like Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary that I feel are being forgotten. What's going on, Arana? And I don't like that very much because it's not just this thing of like honoring tradition or, you know, or lineage or influences. What's going on, Toucan? Is that like Toucan? Or are you like doubly conservative? But yeah, so, you know, there's more to it than that. There are elements of the messages of these people that I think are being lost. By the way, guys, don't forget to hit the like button, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon. My subscriber number has been plummeting this week, and I'm going to do a separate live stream where I'm going to talk about why I think that is. I made the mistake, I guess, of trying to defend certain people that felt like it was an attack, even though it was meant to be like, you know, assistance. So pretty crazy. Anyways, don't want to go down that rabbit hole at the moment, but yeah, so the message that these people were offering to humanity and the importance of it has been lost. You know, like, for example, in the case of Aldous Huxley, the prescience of his assessment of the trajectory of humanity is downright prophetical, and you guys probably know what I'm referencing, Brave New World, right? It's absolutely insane. I mean, down to like virtual reality helmets and SSRIs and Xanax, and it was 1931 when the book was written. You know, this stuff is out. And by the way, in Huxley's case, that was actually before any contact with psychedelics. He wrote that book well before he ever experienced mescaline, which was his first experience. He ended up writing The Doors of Perception in Heaven and Hell based on those mescaline experiences, but we're going to get into all that later. For now, what I want to do is really start at the earliest acknowledgement of the influence of psychedelic compounds on humanity. And I'm really going to do my best in this stream to offer information that you're likely not going to find anywhere else, or at least to connect information with related information in ways that you will not find anywhere else. I'm quite confident that I can do that, and this is one of those instances, actually. Most of the researchers trace the earliest contact with psilocybin mushrooms to, or the first evidence to cave paintings in France, I believe it is. But that's actually not necessarily the oldest record that we have of the use of psychedelics. In South America a few years ago, there was a hollowed out puma bone that had traces of DMT in it because some shaman way back in the day had apparently been smoking either Adenanthera peregrina or Adenanthera colubrina, which you would know as yopo or wilca. The seed snuff that's blown into the nose. It's also said by a lot of people that that is actually how well, there were no tribes there. It was Neanderthals or like just after Neanderthals, like Stone Age. I don't know, 5,000 years ago, roughly, cave paintings that they think depict people eating hallucinogenic mushrooms. That's the story. But this puma bone is at least that old, and there are indications that there could be even older use of yopo and wilca that actually predates the mushroom. And what I was going to say is that a lot of people actually claim that the yopo was actually the stepping stone to ayahuasca. That what actually happened is that the shamans figured out how to use yopo, and during the trance, the plant spirits told them how to make ayahuasca. I don't think that makes any sense at all whatsoever, and I think it's complete bullshit for a number of reasons. But the main reason is that I have so far only heard white people on YouTube talking about that. I live in South America amongst indigenous people. I've been studying this stuff for 30 years. I've never seen any until recently, so I think that's just something the internet has created, honestly. I think it happened the other way around because Yopo is actually more difficult. It's a more complicated process that involves heating snail shells until they turn to ash and then breaking that all down and mixing it with the seeds at a certain ratio. And it would be easier to make ayahuasca. And so at any rate, either way, these plants have been in use with and by humanity for a very, very, very long time. And the reason that that is so significant and important is something that I believe was first suggested by Terence McKenna, although I have to admit that he is occasionally credited for ideas that actually came from people like Aldous Huxley and even Aleister Crowley, because he has become sort of the mainstream pipeline conduit for all of our psychedelic forefathers, and everything kind of trickled down to us through Terence McKenna, including a lot of the connections to the Hermetic mysteries. It turns out I had developed these interests independently of that influence. I was very young when I started to study the mysteries and psychedelics separately, and it was many years before I realized that a lot of these other psychedelic luminaries had also studied both subjects. And again, we'll see why, for very good reason. There's very obvious and very profound connections that not only suggest possible answers for us in our current chaostrophe and the predicament we find ourselves in, but they open doors to a lot of other questions as well. And so back to the psilocybin mushroom, and this is, I think, sort of a reflection of where we find ourselves today at the juncture with another leap in the evolutionary paradigm, at least in terms of consciousness. And the thing about leaps in consciousness is that they actually do require hardware upgrades. You cannot run a Apple app on a 1984 Commodore 64. And in just the same way that that is true, you cannot run advanced consciousness programs on a brain that is not prepared to run that level of program, right? So this is where the neuroplasticity and neurogenesis comes in. And so every time mankind has made one of these leaps, psychedelic plants have entered the picture and provided the catalyst and also conferred the ability to upgrade the hardware. And the last time that this happened, and of course it should be taken for granted that everything that I'm saying is theoretical, although supported by at least anecdotal evidence, the stoned ape theory that people are fairly well familiar with at this point. I think that since the stoned ape theory sort of originated, there have been sort of addendums that have been added by people like Paul Stamets. We have seen fungal entities, I guess, like single-celled slime molds, develop intelligence in certain very specific, what is it called when your intelligence only works along a certain lines? You know, highly specialized intelligence, like in the case of these slime molds. 10 viewers, 3 likes, not cool, guys. Come on. I'm working hard for this. Slime molds that could out-engineer the best engineers in Japan using the best computers that we had, right? And then we also have mycelium demonstrating awareness, according to studies commissioned by Paul Stamets. And we also, since I think the origin of the stoned ape theory, that this development in genetics came after that, when it was first posited by the McKenna brothers, probably in the late 70s, early 70s, mid 70s, somewhere around there. That like, what is it, like 90% of our DNA is fungal, right? So we have this profound relationship that not only do we share this genetic relationship with fungus, but we also the fungus exhibits a lot of behaviors and gives a lot of indications that it has these connections to consciousness that we consider to be unique amongst ourselves. You understand what I mean? And so the theory, of course, of the stoned ape is that it was contact with psilocybin mushrooms that caused the consciousness of humans to move beyond the pragmatic and practical, right? So, you only had to communicate to people, there's water over there, or there's a saber-toothed tiger over there, or, these really basic things that could more or less be communicated with grunts. Or pointing and grunting or whatever. But with the psychedelic experience, now there are abstract concepts. There's a connection with the transcendent other. And all of these kind of abstract and, art and experience of the transcendental that nature does not give us immediate tools to communicate about. And so the idea is that it did two things. It created a biological hardware upgrade so that we were capable of running more sophisticated programs. And we know that that is true because the compounds catalyze neurogenesis, which means how quickly we're developing new neural pathways and new brain cells, and neuroplasticity, which enhances our ability to learn, right? So we suddenly have more to say and a greater capacity to do so, to communicate. There are also indications, I think at least anecdotal, but going back from experiments in the 1960s all the way to the diaries of Sir Walter Raleigh in regards to ayahuasca, for example, that indicate telepathy and the possibility that these compounds actually confer on us, albeit maybe an intermittent and not reliable ability to access capacities of consciousness that are not normally engaged, which might fall under the category of ESP or parapsychological phenomena. And so that is the beginning of the psychedelic story in theory, if not in practice. And so many thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years later, I think hundreds of thousands, I'm not really sure about the exact timeline here, we enter into ancient Egypt. Possibly Greece, but the story seems to have begun in Egypt. And if that's the case, then the compounds that we would be looking for, aside from Blue Lotus, which is actually a very interesting psychoactive flower, but probably not the culprit that we're after in this case. Syrian rue combined with acacia would actually produce something very, very similar to ayahuasca. And anyone that's taken ayahuasca can tell you that it's a whole different animal from the rest of these psychedelics. While it is true that you could take an extraordinarily high dose of psilocybin mushrooms or LSD or something and sort of get a ballpark idea, there's something fundamentally different about the DMT experience. And it also seems to activate the pineal gland. And I do mean that quite literally. And I feel like we're on the verge of being actually able to prove that. I'm actually discouraged that, and confused that there have been less experiments, none that I'm aware of, in recent years to kind of explore this. But the point is that that combination of plants would have been readily available to people in ancient Egypt. And so we have the story of Pythagoras having gone to Egypt and studied the mysteries. And of course, the mysteries being secret, still to this day, you're sworn by the threat of having your tongue cut out of your head and all sorts of other horrors if you divulge the secrets of the apopteia, which is the hidden knowledge of these secret societies. The threat of death. So Pythagoras traveled from Egypt, theoretically again, to Greece, where he founded his mystery schools that dealt with subjects that are connected to music and consciousness and the occult and the fundamental nature of reality and these sort of explorations. And from there were mystery schools that branched out. And we know these as the Eleusinian mysteries and others. And we also know with near certainty that there was something called the Kykeon, and there was Soma, which inspired the name of Aldous Huxley's pill that kind of did the opposite thing that psychedelics do in Brave New World. But we're still way back in ancient Greece now. We haven't caught up with Huxley yet. And so the Eleusinian mysteries had quite the roster. Aristotle, Plato, all sorts of extraordinary figures were coming to these things and consuming whatever it is that was in that vessel. And my suspicion is that it was the Syrian rue acacia mixture that Pythagoras learned about in Egypt, but that would have been readily available in the Mediterranean. Both plants are totally everywhere there. So just for the sake of argument, though, and Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD, did actually, how's it going, Misty, did actually investigate this, and he brewed the ergot fungus, which is the basically the source of the precursor chemicals that LSD is synthesized from. Ergot alkaloids. It's funny too that ergot is like ergo, which is I am, and it's all about metacognition and knowledge of self. It's you can't make this stuff up. But anyways, the ergo fungus. So that's the other potential likelihood, and there's some evidence that it either was the ergot beer, or that was at least also, I got to turn this off. I think it overheats or something and then blinks. Where was I at with this? Oh yeah, there's evidence of the ergot brew because they have found it in the teeth of at least one skull. And ergot, if you do not process it first, it will not just kill you, but it will give you symptoms of gangrene. You will lose your mind. Your limbs will rot off. It's very similar to mercury poisoning. And this brings us to a little tendril, side tributary of the story, because the teachings of Hermes and Thoth in Egypt are mercurial. And Mercury was a psychopomp that brought the dead across to the underworld, and also that it sort of serves this Promethean or Luciferian light bearer kind of role, where this divine knowledge is brought down to mankind, and usually at some kind of great penalty. Christ was also one of these figures that kind of played this role. But Mercury is actually found in around the tombs of several rulers in both Egypt and in a tribe that was related to the Aztecs. So that is really just mind-blowing to me, because either they both understood the nature of Mercury and the symbolic meaning of it, or there was actually a physical connection between these cultures that has not necessarily been elucidated. I know there are people that have suggested things. There's drawings of white guys with beards and stuff that shouldn't be there, and but the reality is we don't have a truly clear answer. Let me look at the chat real quick. Okay, so I don't want to get too far off on this hermetic mercurial trip quite yet, although there's a lot of incredible connections. And this is one of those things when I was thinking about originally putting this video series together and doing this live stream. I think I get this feedback sometimes that I'm like messing with plant medicine or something by introducing these hermetic and mystery school teachings and all that. And the reality is that all of these guys, going all the way back to Aleister Crowley, but Terence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, all of these Western figures in psychedelics all were deeply, deeply, deeply influenced and entrenched in this stuff. So if anything, I feel like I'm just, I just don't think we should forget about this. All right, so the ergot or the acacia. But the important thing is this. During the period when these mysteries were happening in ancient Greece, it was a time of great advances in poetry and philosophy and mathematics and astronomy. There was all kinds of culture and science just absolutely exploding. And for a very long time now, I think 2,000 years or so, right? People, historians are like, what the fuck was happening? Why was everyone so smart? Like, why were they so creative? What was going on? And one of the things that you notice in that is absent in the writings of a lot of these people is a fear of the unknown and fear of the mystery. They were willing to investigate and to contemplate and to admit that they had a fundamental lack of knowledge in regards to a lot of these things that in the modern world people have either just decided not to think about by calling themselves rationalist, materialist, atheist, whatever, or they have faith-based solutions that are, 99.9 with 1,000 nines percent likely to be wrong. You know what I mean? Either solution, no good. So what is this variable? What did they have in ancient Greece that we have been missing from our society? Because we retained a lot of it. We retained a lot of the sciences. We retained a lot of the philosophy. We retained things like democracy, political influence, all of this stuff. But clearly we're missing something. And a big clue to that comes in the writings of Plato, where he says that the reception of the apoptye, which is the secret knowledge of the inner circle of the mysteries, relieved him of his fear of death. And research has shown us beyond any reasonable doubt that the best way to prepare terminal cancer patients and other people that are on death's door in hospices to meet their maker is with massive doses of psychedelics. In fact, one of Aldous Huxley's most gangster moves that he is so widely remembered for was to take 2 very large doses back to back of LSD injected while he was on his deathbed. So I think about 2 hours before he died, he had his second very, very large dose of LSD. And so I think, that revelation may seem in a way to be inconsequential, but I don't think it is at all, because, there are 2 things that are driving the chaostrophe in Western culture more than anything else. And they both have their root in fear, but it's fear of the unknown and fear of death. And these things manifest in all sorts of different ways, including greed. But, the fundamental root is the same. And the antidote to that fear happens to come from compounds like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and ayahuasca. In my opinion, for what it's worth, the reason is probably that what they actually do is that they don't cause hallucinations. They peel back the filtration system in our nervous system. As Aldous Huxley said, the reducing valve, they turn them off. Or down. Most of them turn them down, right? Like even a heroic dose of mushrooms just turns it down, doesn't turn it off. A massive dose of 5-MeO DMT, on the other hand, turns the whole thing all the way off. That's what people are describing. There's nothing there. Just this like blinding white light for lack of a better description, and a feeling of absolute unity and peace with eternity. There's no time, there's no desire, there's no will, there's just absolutely fucking nothing. But it's blissful, but it's nothing. And so I think, you know, perhaps it's not actually possible to assuage the fear of death or the fear of the unknown. So the only real antidote is to experience the ultimate reality, that which we will unite with, whether it's after a series of incarnations or after this life or however it works, to have that experience and then come back. Now you're no longer afraid because you've been there, done that. I think that's the obvious, you know, that's the obvious answer here. Not really that hard to understand, you know, that would be the only real solution to that issue. And so, but we're not trying to really go too far down the rabbit hole of psychedelic medicine or, you know, any of that stuff. I'm trying to actually give a sort of baseline timeline for all of the stuff that happens, because what you guys will find if you learn the history of how psychedelics came to be the first Renaissance, let's call it Renaissance 1.0, in the 1950s and 60s, because it actually started in the 30s, really. I mean, or the 40s, started to build some momentum through the 50s, and then really exploded on the public scene in the mid-60s, right? But a lot of people don't really know how that happened. And the actual story is so insane, with such improbability or probability-defying synchronicities. Like Timothy Leary goes out in search of ayahuasca, which they called yahe back then. They still call it yahe in Colombia, and but that's how they knew it, is what I'm saying. And another guy named William S. Burroughs, who was famous as one of the characters in, what was that beatnik guy, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which was, of course, like a precursor to the hippie culture. So this guy was literally a character in that book, but he was real, you know. And just an absolute monster, lunatic. I mean, we're not going to talk about William S. Burroughs too much, but he was a significant figure in all of this, love it or hate it. And so he was trying to get rid of his heroin habit, and he had heard of this crazy psychedelic called yahe. So he goes down to South America looking for it. Timothy Leary separately, doesn't know him, has never met him in his life, goes down there, and they run into each other in some, like, you know, canteen, or I can't remember how they put it, but basically a little tiny bar in a shack in the 1950s in the middle of nowhere in the Amazon rainforest. And it's in his book, High Priest. Leary talks about walking into this bar, and there's this guy sitting there, and it's William S. Burroughs. Like, what is that? How, you know what I mean? Like, what are the chances? And there's just so much of that, the way that these people intersected. It's actually been fodder for the conspiracy theory people to say, you know, clearly this isn't real. And it's strange because so many of them believe in God, but they don't think that it could have been a hidden hand. It has to be the government. That's always really boggled my mind, that they see it that way, rather than realize this is, like, if anything, divine intervention, you know? And these coincidences and stuff are also impossible because they had to happen. We would be utterly doomed if they had not. And that's, you know, obviously where I lean. But I guess if you believe that anything that's not Jesus, that has any kind of spiritual connotations, is definitely Satan, then that's how you're going to resolve all this. Well, then it's the CIA who's run by Satan. And anyways, yeah, it's unfortunate that all that stuff entered into the equation and people's perception, because it really slowed down our momentum, I think. But so where are we at in this? Okay, so we have just left ancient Greece and the Eleusinian mysteries, and we have established a connection and a need between our culture and that ancient culture, and we have ascertained that psychedelics seem to be the missing component that, you know, has sort of things didn't work as well for us as they did for the Greeks. And I'm not saying that it was perfect. Obviously, there was some weird shit going on, and they had some problems. But, in general, it was like, way longer and way smoother for those guys than it's been for us. And psychedelics were probably to think. Now we are going to have to allow a character to enter into our story that a lot of people do not find agreeable, to put it mildly. But the next major player to enter into this story is someone named Aleister Crowley. And a lot of people don't think about him at all when you think about psychedelics and this whole process of the dissemination of this knowledge and, people suddenly having a commitment to the pursuit of higher consciousness and gnosis and, but it's that guy is just as big of an influence on our modern culture as literally anyone. And it's incredible because a magician, by his definition, was someone that exerts an invisible influence on the human race. And the fact that, he has shaped so many things in your daily life, and most people don't even know his name or think about him. It's pretty fucking remarkable. For good or ill. And I think for good overall. The guy definitely wasn't perfect, but he wrote some of the early, there was also Baudelaire and other people that experimented with opium and hashish and cocaine and heroin and all of these things back in the day. But Crowley was one of the first, and certainly the first to go public with this, being bisexual and defending that publicly, openly bisexual, and promoting this idea of expanding consciousness through meditation, yoga, study of the mysteries, actual initiation into hermetic secret societies, and the use of drugs like mescaline. He was one of the very first people to publish papers about his mescaline experience and about hashish and, for good or ill, a lot of the other drugs as well, and very, very large quantities on very, very regular bases. And so even though I absolutely do advocate reading his best works, like the Book of Lies, and studying maybe the Book of the Law, with the magical and philosophical commentary that you can find on hermetic.com. The important thing to know about him is that, Timothy Leary, for example, said of Aleister Crowley on television in the 1970s that he felt like he was continuing his work, basically almost implying that he felt that he was a reincarnation of Aleister Crowley. Terence McKenna also made an absolutely terrible movie called... I don't know the name of it, but he was supposed to be John Dee, who was a partner with Edward Kelly, who were magicians and scribes to Queen Elizabeth, I think. A couple of really wacky dudes, but they channeled this alleged angelic language called Enochian that has actually been studied by grammaticists, I guess, linguistician, I don't know how the hell you say that, but people that study linguistics, linguisticians or whatever the hell they are, and they determine that it actually does have a legitimate syntax and grammar. And these two guys almost definitely would not have been capable of faking that. It's like almost impossible that that's the case. So, Terence McKenna made a movie where he was supposed to be John Dee. His only part was to stand there looking regal in like Victorian clothing, or older than Victorian, I don't know how long, way far back in the day. And of course, you guys probably know that like every rock band ever in the history of music was heavily influenced by Aleister Crowley. The Beatles, he was in the top left corner of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin bought Boleskine House where Crowley lived. Ozzy Osbourne's song Mr. Crowley. Hall & Oates, Sting said that he studied Crowley's work 5 hours a day for like 10 years. Let's see, Sting... I don't have to go through it. You guys know it's everyone. Everyone. So monumentally important influence. And it was from, and this is interesting too. Crowley came to the United States and he went to San Francisco and he went to Greenwich Village. You guys know anything about those two places? He actually claimed to have left consciousness bombs of some type, like a bomb. That's how he described it, that there would be an explosion of this consciousness in both of those places at some point in the future. And those are the two places where the psychedelic renaissance began in the United States. So super, super weird. Super weird. And of course, his influence on the Grateful Dead and other people would have a lot of, the whole idea of everyone having their own sovereignty and nobody telling anyone else what to do, and discovering your deepest, truest purpose and pursuing it with every breath, and that kind of philosophy, obviously heavily influenced by Crowley. And so after Crowley, we had Aldous Huxley. And Aldous Huxley was a English author. He kind of looked like a Frankenbowie, like David. He looked exactly, when I make this video, watch it. He looks just like David Bowie, and I noticed that before I noticed that they both have that two different color eye thing going on. I couldn't believe that I didn't notice that all these years. But I'll put pictures of them next to each other. It's really remarkable how identical they look. But okay, so Huxley. Huxley basically got famous as an author for writing very dry, in my opinion, pretty boring satire of English bourgeoisie in the 1920s, and maybe even a little earlier. I think he was writing for Vogue magazine by 1917 or 1921 or something like that. And so I don't think that he tried mescaline until the 1950s. It could have, I think, the 1950s. And of course, his books on the subject are not that interesting to anyone that has actually taken mescaline, because you read it and you're like, yeah, that's what mescaline does. I've done this too. I mean, it's not that remarkable, but for the time it was a monumental thing, because you have to imagine, I'm sure most of you guys have taken psychedelics. You remember what the 1950s looked like? I mean, none of us were there, I would assume. I don't have really anybody over 60 in my audience, so most of you guys definitely weren't there. But you've seen, like, clippings. We have some idea of how straight and bland and white and fucking white picket fence, and you know what I mean? It just looks like, for me, absolute hell on earth. Leave It to Beaver and all that kind of shit, just absolute nightmare. And a lot of people like to remember it as like this wholesome time where everyone respected each other, and you could get away with like raping teenage girls and killing black people and all this kind of shit. And it's just crazy how people do that. But you know what it was like. You have an idea. It was pretty messed up. And so to come from that, or even earlier in the case of someone like Huxley, and suddenly you're on LSD or you're on mescaline, I just cannot even imagine the feeling that they must have had as like the first wave of, psychedelicized humans. Jerry Garcia and the people in the Haight-Ashbury area in like the early 60s. I think the first time that they took LSD, it was probably 1961, 1962, something like that. So even my point, though, is to find a book like The Doors of Perception and read those stories of this compound doing these extraordinary things to Huxley's mind. It must have been incredibly fascinating. And of course, most of you guys probably know that the band The Doors actually took their name from that book, The Doors of Perception. I think the quote is, "There is the known and the unknown, and between them is the doors of perception." And for what it's worth, I don't really care much for any of Huxley's novels. I think they're actually kind of badly written. He was absolutely brilliant. I mean, the guy had his conceptualization had outgrown or outsized, overstepped the English language to the extent that he created 7 words that were accepted into the Oxford Dictionary. 7 words. Because, you know what I mean? He's conceptualizing shit there's no language for, so they had to make new words for the guy. But what I'm saying about that is his essays, if you're interested in Huxley, a lot of people just read Brave New World and maybe The Doors of Perception and then move on because no one wants to read Chrome Yellow or After Many a Summer the Swan Dies or Tomorrow, 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 and Tomorrow, or any of that stuff. But you should read the essays, the collected essays. In fact, when I was like 13 years old and I first got into this stuff, or found Huxley, I was either 12 or 13. I wanted to get this quote from one of his essays on my back, and it was something like, "It is fear of the labyrinthine flux and the inhospitable strangeness of the world." And the labyrinthine flux, by the way, is a term that he came up with to describe how the phenomena that we deal with is ever changing, and it's like a maze. And so because it's always changing, when we're trying to resolve some metaphysical, spiritual, philosophical, political, scientific question, by the time we could be going the right way, and then there's suddenly a new wall there. You know what I mean? That term actually inspired the movie Labyrinth, where that was happening in the labyrinth. So it is fear of the labyrinthine flux and the inhospitable strangeness of the world that has driven men into the systems prepared for them by philosophers and the founders of religion. Weary with much wandering through the maze of phenomena, frightened by the inhospitable strangeness of the world, men have rushed into these systems as if rushing from a dark and frightening jungle into a well-lit, commodious house, and men have been burned at the stake for questioning the color of a door or the shape of a window. And so, you know, when I was a preteen or teenager, early teenager, Huxley was my guy, and I was seriously planning to get that tattooed on my back, but I just never did it. But yeah, the collected essays of Huxley. And so around the same time that Huxley was taking mescaline and writing books about it, there was a guy in Switzerland working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals named Dr. Albert Hofmann. And no, he was not a CIA agent. And no, this was not a government conspiracy. There's just no, it's just not real. What he was actually doing is looking for a way to induce vasoconstriction to help with bleeding during surgery and during childbirth, and also to treat migraine headaches. In fact, when I was bitten by a kissing bug or an assassin bug a few weeks ago, months ago, actually, never going to recover from that fully, by the way, thank you very much. I had migraines, and they actually gave me an ergot alkaloid that was isolated by Dr. Hoffman. So we actually still use some of the other ergot derivatives that came from his experiments with ergot. So, by the way, you guys, do me a favor, hit the like button, share, subscribe, support my channel. People have been unsubscribing like mad all week. Like I said, I'm going to do a different stream about that to explain it. Literally, this entire history, all of this information, all of it, I'm just doing off the top of my head. So, I've put in the hours doing the research for you guys. So, we really do appreciate your support, because I cannot continue to make this content to the extent that I do unless I have some support. So there are options to support in the chat, and you can join our Patreon and learn all about the mysteries directly from the writings of 33rd Degree Masons and other formerly secret works. Okay, so Albert Hofmann is messing around with the ergot fungus in Switzerland. And hold on, I have to put these. When it rains, I can't hear very well. So he's messing around with this ergot fungus, and he makes a series of extractions, or not really extractions, but syntheses. I don't even know how to say that. Syntheses. And the 25th one was lysergic acid diethylamide tartrate 25. And the 25 only means that it was the 25th derivative in that sequence of experiments or whatever. And so this was 1938, and he put it on the shelf, and kind of forgot about it because he gave it to rats and he noticed their pupils dilate, but he didn't really notice anything else. There's a really great movie, by the way, called The Rats of Nim that is a cartoon that is obviously about giving LSD to rats that then become conscious and create a civilization and start talking. And it's from like the late 60s or something. It's completely awesome. It was one of my favorite cartoons when I was a very small child. It's no surprise, right? But anyways, Rats of Nim aside, didn't notice anything happening to the rats. Their hair kind of stood up a little bit. Their pupils dilated. But no biggie. And so he put it on a shelf. And this is the one part of the story that is a little bit sketch because it can't possibly be true. And this is where the conspiracy theorists are kind of like, well, you know, we got you here because how do you explain this? He did not spill it on himself. LSD will not soak through your skin. I don't care how many hippies have told you that their friend was standing in line and he sweated too much and he absorbed all this. They have done experiments. It'll membranes like your tongue, your eyeball, your vagina, your anus, whatever, but not just through your skin. Not happening. Period. End of story. Doesn't happen. So, the possibility is that he got some on his hand and he touched his mouth or he even rubbed his eye because it takes so little LSD. And I think people kind of underestimate the true tininess of a dose of LSD. If you take a visible amount of LSD crystal, you're probably in trouble. Although, to the credit of LSD, and it kind of adds to how astonishing and amazing it is, there have been several cases, 10 in total, where people accidentally snorted lines of pure crystalline LSD and went to the hospital because in every case it was a group of people and somebody, for whatever reason, had like a gram of LSD crystal in their pocket and they put it on the table and they crushed it up and everybody did a line thinking it was MDMA or something. And so they all consumed about 20,000 micrograms of LSD. They were all back to baseline within 12 hours and all of them were checked on 5 years later and not one of them had had a single flashback or any kind of mental illness or any problems at all whatsoever. And in fact, they all considered it the most important thing that ever happened to them. So, it's really important, I think, that we sort of dispel the myths because people say all kinds of stuff. Like, I took a bunch of acid, I was high for 3 days. No, you didn't. If you took something and you were high for 3 days, it might have been DOM, it might have been STP, but it was not LSD. Or you were just dramatizing and making stuff up for attention because it doesn't matter how much LSD you take, that's not going to happen. Lots and lots of myths around this stuff, but I just wanted to mention that it is so incredibly safe. And it even seems to have safety mechanisms kind of built into it. Because if you try to abuse it and you keep taking it, what'll happen is it'll just stop working. And you have to double the dose if you take it consecutive days, and then even more than double it after only a few days. So there's like built-in mechanisms. Psilocybin has this as well. DMT does not. But I think DMT is a lot less, ayahuasca in particular, is a lot less prone to abuse. It's not, I wouldn't even call it fun exactly. I mean, it's amazing, but fun is probably the wrong word, at least for me. So where are we at with this? Back to Albert Hoffman. So he either got it in his eye or in his mouth because it does not soak into your skin. No matter what anyone tells you, it's not true. Also, while we're on the subject of busting myths, there's also no such thing as dirty LSD. It's either LSD or it's not LSD. And it's really easy to understand this. And someone that I met has actually talked to Brotherhood of Eternal Love LSD chemists about this. I don't know who that might have been, but somebody somewhere. And definitely from the horse's mouth, there are, and this is what I always thought, that there's no impurity on Earth. There's nothing that is a byproduct of the synthesis of LSD that is so potent in the 100, 200 microgram range. Even if you took the byproduct pure, it would not have any noticeable impact, right? It would have no effect. So if you take 200 micrograms of LSD and there's a tiny little bit of some byproduct in there, you're not going to feel it. No such thing as dirty LSD. You either have something off in your body, it's something that you ate, it's something that is lodged in your spiritual, energetic being, your emotional body, whatever it is, No such thing as dirty acid. It might not be acid. It could be ALD52. It could be 1P-LSD. It could be fucking a whole big long list of analogs and similar chemicals. And the chemist makes one little mistake and he has something that's like LSD. You know what I mean? So, but facts is facts. There's not strychnine in it. It's just stupid. There's no reason to do that. You know, people used to say you have to use it to bond it to paper and stuff. It's not real. So back to Dr. Hoffman. He gets some in his mouth. He gets some on his eyeball, whatever happened. And he's riding his bike home. And in his words, he was overwhelmed by phantagoric phantasms. Something along those lines, fantastic phantasms, you know, and so he was like, what in the fuck was that? And so he goes back to the lab and he knows, well, I handled this stuff and I spilled a little bit on my hands. So maybe if I just take, I think 500 micrograms or something, because at the time there was nothing that would be active in the 500 microgram range. So he thought, this is a tiny, tiny little bit of LSD and no big deal. And he goes to ride his bike home, and he is, I think this is actually the second time is when he got overwhelmed by the fantastic phasmagorums, or however he put it. And then so he went home, and he called the doctor, and the doctor came, and he said, you know, your heart rate's a little weird, but you're definitely overall just fine. And that was the discovery of LSD. And this was happening more or less in step with Huxley having his experience and writing a book about it. And so while all that is happening, there's a guy named Dr. Timothy Leary who has had a hell of a time over the last couple of years, and I would strongly suggest to anyone out there to read his book, High Priest, because it is an extraordinary tale of, you know, synchronicities with an improbability factor that just are, you know, up there with the Big Bang or something. I mean, it's pretty incredible stuff. But I'm going to just do a quick synopsis, I guess. And so Dr. Leary had just lost his wife to suicide. He was severely depressed and alcoholic, so he took his two kids, Jack and Susan, to France, where he got extremely sick. His hands swelled up like two balloons, and he had a headache, and it was just like that Pink Floyd song, Comfortably Numb, weirdly similar. He may have written that book after that song came out and kind of drew from that as, I don't know, it's weird, but basically Comfortably Numb happened to him. And so he got a job at Harvard in the psychiatry department, and he went to Harvard to work because they were paying him a lot of money, I'm sure. And some colleague, we miss Gordon Wasson. Okay, so somewhere between Huxley taking mescaline and Hoffman discovering that he had LSD in his laboratory, there was another guy named Gordon Wasson, who was, I think, president of Sears and Roebuck, or CEO of Sears and Roebuck, definitely a banker. He and his wife Valentina had become extremely fascinated in mushrooms, and they had noticed that some people in some areas tended to worship them. So we have the, I guess, Nordic, like the Vikings and the Sungus, who are a Siberian tribe that eat the amanita in various ways. In the case of, I think it's the Sungus, they eat them, and the big warriors eat them, and then they pee, and the pee is still psychoactive, and then everyone else drinks the pee because the big warriors filter out the more toxic stuff. Way easier to just sun dry it and convert the, I think it's the muscimol to ibotenic acid. Sun drying does that, so it makes it a lot. No, not J.P. Morgan. Oh, are you saying he worked for J.P. Morgan? Yeah, well, something like that, some Babylon shit. So, so he noticed that there was some amanita eating going on, and also he had heard somehow about how there were indigenous people in Mexico and other places that ate these little mushrooms that they believed walked in the footsteps of Jesus. They had not believed that they grew in the footsteps of Jesus for long, but that's where they were at by the time they intersected with Gordon Wasson. So Wasson flies down to Mexico, and he meets a woman named Maria Sabina. And Maria Sabina gives him like an unbelievable dose of mushrooms. I mean, I've known this story for 30 years or something, but I only recently found out the dosage that she gave him. And I guess she was thinking, you know, we're going to just really just wake these crackers up. Like, it was ridiculous. I don't want to say, but I think it was like 30 grams or something. Just absolutely just sent them to another dimension. And so I'm going to put out an actual video with all this stuff in much more detail with, you know, graphics and more specific details, because I'm literally telling you guys all this stuff from memory from having studied it like 30 years ago or something. But the next exact sequence of events is not that important, but I'm not 100% that I have it chronologically exactly correct. But more or less what happened is that Gordon Wasson ate the stuff and he thought, well, if some shit like this exists, probably should tell somebody in psychiatry at Harvard. And so he sent the mushrooms to... Is that... Yeah, he sent the mushrooms to Leary. And Leary... or maybe he just... No, he told Leary. He told him. He sent him a letter, because then Leary got his colleagues together and flew to Cuernavaca, and they rented a mansion, and they found the mushrooms, and they ate a ton of them. Leary was 53 years old when he had this first psychedelic experience. I think it was like 1959 or something like that. And so after this insane, you know, week in Cuernavaca with these Harvard psychiatry, you know, board member people tripping in this mansion, and it's all in High Priest. Definitely recommend that you guys all read the book if you haven't. They fly back to Harvard, and Hoffman has had the same thought, that he should send this stuff to the psychiatry department at Harvard. So Leary more or less gets back. You know, I don't know if this happened immediately, but I'm pretty sure it was within a week. He gets back to Harvard, and there are LSD pills sitting on his desk. And so when that happens, he's like, huh, let me try this. And he eats it, and he's like, wow, that's almost exactly the same as the psilocybin that I just ate. So he sends Hoffman the mushrooms to have him analyze. And so Albert Hoffman becomes gets the prestigious distinction of having synthesized LSD for the first time, which actually would get a second like layer of prestige, because it was the first time that a chemical was synthesized in the laboratory before it was found in nature. And a few years after the synthesis of LSD, someone figured out that there was lysergic acid amide, which is, you know, LSD is lysergic acid diethylamide, and the Morning Glory LSD is LSA, lysergic acid amide. So it's very, very similar. It's a much gnarlier trip. I mean, it's not... By the way, too, if you're going to try that, which I'm not advising anything algorithm, and I'm actually not, because I think there are easier ways to go about this. But if you can't help yourself, if you eat the blue ones and your skin turns blue, don't panic. You're not dying. I thought I was dying, because I thought, oh my God, there's probably pesticides. I bought the seeds at Walmart, you know, I was like 15 or something. And their skin turned blue, and we're like, oh my God, what the fuck is happening to us? And it turned out that the dye that makes the flowers blue is already in the seeds. And so if you eat a high dose of Heavenly Blue Morning Glory seeds, a lot of times the pigment in your skin will temporarily turn blue, which is pretty scary if you're, you know, feeling super sick, because it's much more toxic than LSD. LSD is like actually extremely non-toxic as far as, like, you know, uber powerful chemicals go. The lethal dose is something insane, like a half a gallon or something for a 150 pound man or 185 pound man. I can't remember what the LD50 is based on exactly, but at any rate, so LSD was the first chemical that was discovered in a laboratory before an analog was discovered in nature. And Albert Hoffman became the first person to isolate psilocybin and psilocin and figure out what was going on with these mushrooms. And so from there, Leary meets up with Aldous Huxley and Allen Ginsberg and another, I can't remember everyone that was there, but certainly Leary was there, Huxley was there, and they created a sort of group of intellectuals that were in the know, that had experienced psychedelics, and they knew something big was happening. And they had to figure out what to do about it. And of course, Leary was like raving mad, like, we need to put it in the water and turn on the whole goddamn world. They're all going to kill us if we don't. Like, you know what I mean? He wasn't wrong. He definitely wasn't wrong. And I've seen old video of him that is amazing, where he is like, you know, they stick a bunch of cameras in his face because he's a Harvard doctor, and it's the late 1950s, early 1960s, and people totally are just like, you know, well, what should we do, doctor? You know, and he's like, well, maybe instead of getting angry with your children, you should turn on with them, see what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it, and try to understand it yourselves. You know, and so the establishment is going like, holy fucking crap, we got this Harvard psychiatrist going in the news and telling people to eat acid with their kids. Like, they lost their shit, obviously. And actually Nixon called Timothy Leary later on down the road. I don't think it was Alan Watts. It's not LSH, it's LSA. But yeah. So where was I at with this? Okay, yeah, so they really didn't like Timothy Leary. And this all happened because they had these meetings with at least Allen Ginsberg, Timothy Leary, and Aldous Huxley. And Leary said that Huxley would sit at these meetings with his eyes closed, and then every once in a while he would just sit up and make a diamond pure comment and then fold his arms back up and go into his meditative pose or whatever. But Huxley was of the opinion that they should be kept quiet, and that only scientists, philosophers, politicians. By the way, for the first time in my lifetime, I have heard a presidential candidate advocate psychedelics, including ayahuasca. RFK Jr. has been talking about the benefits of ayahuasca in some of the podcasts he's been doing, which blew my mind. His son is taking it. He's all about it. He also knew anecdotes that are extremely obscure that not really blew my mind, like stuff that I'm the only person I've ever like encountered that had ever heard some of these things, like that LSD was going to be the 13th step in AA, and that's actually why one of the founders split with the organization, because they were like, no. Yeah, he knew that story. So interesting times. Here we are again, psychedelic explosion on the horizon, on the verge of civil war, all kinds of cultural clashes going on, some ridiculous war looming in the horizon, and some Kennedy trying to ride in on a white steed and get himself shot in the head. Like, this is one of the reasons I was saying we have to look back into the past to figure out what to do in the future. And it's not just about getting lessons, learning lessons so that we don't repeat them again. It's my opinion that history is literally just these, like, it's energy, and there are patterns and geometries in it, and it is so specific, the repetition of these cycles, that, I mean, look how similar the moment we are in now is to the last time we were in exactly the same position. The only thing that is different is the magnitude of everything has become greater. What is it, like the gamble? There's a better word. Not the odds. The what's, you know, on the line is greater. The magnitude of the potential shitstorm is off the Richter scale. So, so Huxley is like, we need to keep this quiet. We need to give it to the politicians and the artists and the whatever. And Leary's like, nope. I'm calling all the news agencies. I got Harvard clout, dog. I'm finna blow this shit up. And that's what he did. And so a lot of people have blamed Timothy Leary for prohibition and accused him of being a federal agent and all sorts of hate. And by the way, if you haven't read any Timothy Leary, Neuropolitique, and a lot of the other talks that he gave and stuff, man, he's, I think, more important than Terence McKenna. And one of the reasons I did this stream is because it just bugs me that people are ignoring him. There's like 2.2 thousand videos on YouTube about McKenna, but only a few hundred about Timothy Leary. And I think it's pretty tragic, because Tim Leary was arguably more important and more profound in his writings and his talks. Well, let's see, where are we at with this? But the reality is that it wasn't Leary's fault. What actually happened is there were studies going on all over the place. And wish I could remember the guy's name. You can find him on YouTube talking about the moment that this happened. But they were all studying psychedelics all over the place, and they were just blown away. You know, I think MDMA had just been synthesized too. So, you know, they're looking at this stuff and they're going like, whoa, we can fix everything with this. In fact, the guy was Winona Ryder's father. Michael Hollingshead. Tim Leary was Winona Ryder's godfather, by the way, in case any of you guys were unaware of that. Yeah, the psilocybin prison project, super interesting Leary experiment that he did, taking huge heroic doses of psilocybin in a prison with a bunch of murderers and shit. But what was I saying about Winona Ryder? And okay, so there's these experiments going on, and one of the researchers said, as his, I don't know what you call it, like his conclusion or whatever, that he submitted to the federal government that commissioned him to do the studies, that these compounds can treat every known psychological aberration, and oftentimes with a single dose. I think Big Pharma got wind of that, and they said, send men with guns and stop this shit now. So it had nothing to do with Timothy Leary. I mean, it might not have helped that, you know, he was telling people on the news to eat acid with their kids or whatever, but the real hammer came down when the researchers submitted these papers to the federal government, not saying we need to protect the public from, oh yeah, we didn't talk about the acid test, but we're not there yet. We're not quite there yet. I probably will make it all the way to the present day before we're done. Yeah, so the federal government, at the behest of Big Pharma, and if you guys think about the social impact, the cost of that, considering, you know, in light of the research that has been done again recently, and we're hearing eerie echoes of those original researchers coming from places like Johns Hopkins, where we're being told that, again, almost exactly the same words. He probably did this deliberately, but one of the researchers at Johns Hopkins said, we can treat basically every known psychological problem. Oh, no, actually, I remember exactly what he said. It is simply unprecedented in the history of psychiatry that any compound can treat so many psychological issues oftentimes with a single dose. That's what he said. And I don't know if you guys noticed that whole thing about single dose that keeps coming up. Can't make much money off that, right? So, yeah, that's why psychedelics were banned. And what I was saying is, if you think about all the addictions, they're saying that addiction can be treated with an 85% higher success rate than any conventional therapy. Can you imagine how many less drunk driving deaths there would be? How many less crackheads would be out robbing? You know what I mean? If this stuff had been legal and used as it needs to be used all the way back to the 1950s when they first became aware of this, how much different would our society, like, what did they really do to us by banning psychedelics for all these years? Not to mention all the innocent people that have been sitting in prison. But when you really think about the social harm that they did by lying and denying people access to these life-saving, life-changing compounds, it's just absolutely one of the greatest grievances that humanity has against its overlords, quite likely the absolute highest. And so the hammer came down, and the men with guns showed up, and they said, "This is done now, today. You're done now." They were like literally in the middle of this one researcher. You can find him on YouTube. I don't know his name, but they were in the middle of like LSD sessions with people, and the guys came with the paperwork saying, "You're done as of now. This is illegal as of now." And so that was that. And somebody mentioned King Kesey and the Grateful Dead and that whole thing, and that is actually really important because without two people, namely Jerry Garcia and Terence McKenna, this whole psychedelic revolution or psychedelic renaissance would have died probably in the 1970s, because the Matrix basically dangled some houses and cars and comfort in front of the hippies, and they all just became yuppies and forgot what the fuck they were doing and just went to work, and now they're boomers and whatever. So that happened. But luckily, there was a guy named King Kesey who wrote a book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and there are some incredible interviews. I actually bought all of the existing video footage of the acid tests from King Kesey's son at a Fish concert many years ago. Pulled up next to the Further bus, and I just couldn't believe it. And I thought he was King Kesey for a second because he looked so much like him, and then I realized, wait a minute, are you dead? And then he had a picture of Kesey on his shirt, and I was like, wait a minute, what the fuck is going on? I was like, are you his son? Sure enough, and a couple of Garcia's daughters were on the Further bus. It was insane. And he sold me the footage of the acid tests. And in the beginning, there's this interview where the press, because this was slightly before the guys with guns showed up, I think like 1966, at the same year. It's 1965, excuse me. So 1966 is when they federally made LSD legal. And 1965, the acid tests where the Grateful Dead played their first gig as the Grateful Dead at King Kesey's parties in L.A., and I don't remember where the other one was, but basically a couple thousand people came to these places where they had these gigantic barrels, and in the video you can actually watch Owsley, who was the Grateful Dead sound man and the chemist that made most of the LSD that was consumed in the 1960s. Interestingly, the other guy that made the Orange Sunshine and pretty much all the rest of it recently died in the same town that I happened to move to in Ecuador. His widow is still there, which was insane to realize. Like, of all the places I could end up, this random town in Ecuador where this LSD chemist has retired. But yeah, he died almost as soon as I got there. But yeah, that was a mind blower. So what was I saying? Okay, so Owsley was at the acid test, and they're putting all this crystal LSD into these big barrels and mixing it up with Kool-Aid, and there are Hell's Angels running around, just as friendly as puppies, and twirling around, people climbing through the rafters naked, brushing their hair straight up over and over and over and over and over and over and over. Like, it was complete madness, and they were taking massive, massive doses, and it was totally legal. So that was a pivotal moment, because that is when the Grateful Dead realized that telepathy was real, according to them. For one thing, they said that they figured out that they could actually trade bodies with people and just, zip around the room and experience the band from the perspective of the collective mind, or from an individual in the audience, or from their own perspective, or Jerry could float over into Phil's body and play bass, or whatever they needed to do, along with all sorts of other revelations. And they were also students of the mysteries. So there was that connection as well. But we all know what happened after that. This jug band took LSD, and before they were done, they were buying spare parts from NASA so that they could build their sound system out of pieces from the space shuttle. You know what I mean? Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Jug band takes LSD, makes $1 billion, changes the world. Like, it sounds like a joke, but that's actually what happened. And so, I'm not going to get too much into the Grateful Dead thing, although it is amazing. But basically what happened is the Grateful Dead basically was the distribution system for all of this LSD that kept this psychedelic movement alive. And the energy at those concerts was the other thing. This torch that, you know, people forgot what the fuck was going on throughout the 70s and 80s. People became shallow. They were all fucking fumed out on hairspray, and, you know, their spandex pants were choking out their blood circulation, and it was a mess. By the way, guys, hit the like button, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon, where you can join our secret streams, and there are options to provide support in the chat. I am demonetized, and, you know, as you can see, I've been talking for about 2 hours telling you this entire history off the top of my head. So if you support that sort of thing, please show it. What is this? So where are we at with this? Okay, so the LSD and mushrooms and the whole energy, the torch basically was carried by the Grateful Dead through the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. The only other influence that was really, really repping that shit was Terence McKenna. And I'm sure most of you guys know the Terence McKenna story, so I'll just touch on it. But he was basically a overeducated upper middle class kid from Peoria, Colorado. And he and his brother, who was actually a neuroscientist, or at least he is now, went to Colombia, and they were looking for ayahuasca, much in the same way that William S. Burroughs and Tim Leary were back in the day, in the 50s. And I think the story is that they did not find the ayahuasca, but they did find Amazon subcubensis growing all over the place. And trust me, if you find cattle here, I mean, and now it's sad because of the deforestation, but you can literally pick psilocybin mushrooms all day, every day. Like, you could just start picking in one spot and just keep walking and picking, and they'll never run out, like, ever. Like, you won't be able to walk. The sun will go down. You know what I mean? Like, you could just fill pickup trucks all day or something. It's fucking crazy. And then in the mountains here, there's also Pinellas cyanescin, which is much, much stronger and a much, much better experience. I much prefer those. We don't find those here in the jungle much. So they ate a ton of mushrooms. From reading the stories, it sounds like McKenna basically had a psychotic break, but these psilocybin-induced psychotic breaks are much more like the traditional mystical experience of piercing the veil. And it sounds like they connected with some interdimensional intelligences, downloaded a bunch of information, some of which may not have been exactly accurate, but time will only tell. One of the most interesting things, though, is the holographic theory of mind. And as I mentioned earlier, if you really want to understand where McKenna and his brother, or the McKenna brothers, were coming from, having a background in Hermeticism and the mystery school traditions is extremely important. There's another super, super important figure named Joseph Campbell, who was a Harvard mythologist that was really important to the story, and it's thanks to him that these people had books and access to a lot of writings on the mysteries. He really was extremely important, and somehow, even though he was like an old square, Harvard mythologist from he was way old by the time the Grateful Dead existed, but he ended up at Grateful Dead concerts, and he actually said of the Grateful Dead that they were the antidote to the atom bomb, and he also said that he had seen actual natural magic twice in his life, once in the jungles of Borneo and at Grateful Dead concerts. So there's actually, if you're interested, there are, or there is one interview of Joseph Campbell and Jerry Garcia actually being interviewed together, which is just fucked up. That's just insane. I can't believe that happened. But yeah, so the point is, though, that if you really want to understand the McKenna brothers, you need to understand the Hermetic teachings and books like the Kabbalion and the works of people like Aleister Crowley, because a lot of the ideas, I think, that are just kind of, people think that they just sort of came out of the McKennas all of a sudden. That's not what happened. There was evolution, and there was a process, and there was a lineage, as there always is in these shamanic traditions, where the knowledge is transmitted from person to person and from plant to person. But yeah, so after the experiences in South America, Terence eventually got his head together a lot maybe, and went on to, of course, write a bunch of books about DMT and to rant about DMT and also to trick everyone. And it's important, I think, that we all take note of this, because most of us take psychedelics to make ourselves better people. And in a similar way that I have seen a lot of predatory people sneak into vegan communities because they think, well, all vegans are spiritual and elevated, and therefore no vegan could ever mean anyone harm because they can't even hurt a fucking bee. You know what I mean? But it's not real. And psychedelics are also not a guarantee that, you know, a person is going to be 100% forthright. And it actually turns out that Terence Mckenna almost definitely fudged his numbers and knew that he did that, and knew that his time wave zero mathematics did not work and that novelty theory was not correct. And so there was an entire movement expecting the end of the world in 2012, or for us to pass into a fifth dimensional reality where novelty, which was supposed to be, and I think novelty is real, just for the record, but his omega point was not. And the idea was that novelty is basically the force that causes creativity, to put it like very simply. And he was positing that it ebbs and flows through human history in much the same way that other forces like gravity and electromagnetic energy and all of these kind of things do. But he challenged the mathematical community to do to check his math, I think, assuming that no one would take him seriously and that no one would do it. And someone did. And he wrote a paper called Autopsy of a Mathematical Theory. And he said that he noticed that there was a string of numbers that had been reversed in order to make the equations work, and that it appeared to have been done deliberately. And when he confronted Terence about it, he basically just acted like you would expect someone to act when they get caught in a massive lie. So, you know, I'm not trying to say that Terence McKenna did not offer a tremendous amount of benefit, that his role on this planet wasn't extraordinarily important, but I think it is also important that we take note of the missteps of our heroes and learn from the mistakes of the people that came before us, and to also not make the mistake that, as Aleister Crowley put, is the most common for any magician, to believe that his magic can do more for him than it can. And that would mean that, in this case, that psychedelics are going to necessarily make people 100% honest and good. And, you know, it's really important to remember that narcissists can survive psychedelics, and that, you know, it's, if it's not taken with the right intent, under the right circumstances, by the right people and all of that sort of stuff, that there are absolutely no guarantees. There are limitations, and everyone is human and can make mistakes. So, you know, I'm still a huge fan of Terence McKenna in general. He was a massive influence on my early development, I guess. And, you know, I mean, but we need to take note of that little bit of deviancy there, I think. There's one other figure that I didn't mention that he did not play nearly the pivotal role that the rest of these people did, but I think was, you know, maybe even more important, at least in terms of like consciousness, and just his writings, I think, were far more advanced than Terence McKenna or Timothy Leary. Although Robert Anton Wilson did actually really, really, really look up to Timothy Leary. I mean, he considered him important beyond words. And Timothy Leary had that same respect for Robert Anton Wilson. In fact, he said that the book, the Illuminatus trilogy, which is to this day my favorite book, and even though it's 1,100 pages long and very difficult to read, every single person I have ever recommended it to has read it at least 3 times. I've probably read it 6. It is absolutely extraordinary, and it actually contains the only like absolutely documented precognition that is basically indisputable. And there's actually video of him in his last interview before he died that you can find on YouTube talking about this. But in the Illuminatus trilogy, there was a pyramid at the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean, and he gives the coordinates. And in 2003, right before he died, that pyramid was actually located at the bottom of the ocean in exactly that spot, and he actually lived to see that. And there are also, in the early part of the book, and this is in the early 1970s it was written, There are terrorist attacks that are staged by the government with the purpose of stripping people's rights away. Basically, 9/11 is in the book in 1974. So I really, really strongly recommend Robert Anton Wilson, especially Prometheus Rising and Cosmic Trigger 1 and 2. Cosmic Trigger 1 is the final secret of the Illuminati, and he's not kidding. So definitely check out Robert Anton Wilson, but overall, he doesn't play as much of a significant role in our story. He's just sort of a supporting cast character. And so that basically brings us to the present moment where Rome is burning. People are more divided than they've probably ever been at any point in my life. Yes, Pope Bob. Somebody's asking, what are Crowley's biggest sins? No one knows. Crowley definitely wrote a lot of very, very regrettable things. Most of them were meant to be jokes. And some of the most horrible stuff, he actually said that they were exercises because he felt like if you really wanted to understand the omnipotent consciousness that underlies the total totality of existence, that you needed to understand from the darkest possible places to the absolute highest and lightest. My prophets' heads will rise above their heavens. My prophets' heads will rise above the heavens, but their feet will drag below the hills. So it's not clear what he actually may or may not have done. And personally, I don't really care that much, because the teachings and the way that he was able to articulate these sort of initiated secrets of consciousness, there's no one else that wrote with that kind of precision and concision and literary pyrotechnics. There's definitely unrivaled, period, end of story. So that's, basically the value of Aleister Crowley. Man, I feel like we were almost okay. So we're back. We're up to the present day. Daniel Pinchbeck. Who cares? I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but there's just really nothing like groundbreaking or. And also, there's been a lot of scandal around that guy. So and kind of bad stuff. Speaking of the sins of Crowley. And then there was this guy that was like eating mushrooms and holding his breath for 15 minutes in martial arts and all this stuff. But I tried to watch one of his videos. I can't remember his name, and I apologize for that. But he was just making stuff up, like things that I knew to be absolutely false over and over again right away. And I've never looked any more into him. So, you guys let me know too if there are psychedelic luminaries that exist in the current moment that I'm not aware of. Please fill me in. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this series of videos, is that I don't really feel like we have that, and people have lost the connection and appreciation with Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson and even Huxley, the what do you call them, essays of Huxley. But we definitely have found ourselves perched precariously on a perilously perched on a precarious precipice, pondering, whatever. I mean, we're in deep shit, and the future is extremely uncertain. So I think it's really important for us to really avail ourselves of every bit of wisdom and utilize all of the resources to try to get our compass oriented, to figure out how it is that we can rise above our schisms, stop playing the ism-schism game, and find some unity amidst the roar of propaganda and chaos and confusion and illusion and delusion, and actually get something done. It is an extraordinary waste of human potential that we have already had to endure over the last 50, 60 years, that we had an opportunity to reconcile a lot of our issues and heal a lot of our ancestral trauma with psychedelics and plant medicine, and that was unfairly taken from us in the interest of the profit of a very small group of people. And the collateral damage of that has been, tens of thousands of lives. Addiction is running absolutely rampant in the streets. Violence is, absolutely incredibly abundant. Wars that are unnecessary, and people are still predisposed to indoctrination by propaganda and political agendas. And it seems to me that free thinking, critically thinking people are increasingly uncommon, despite the fact that the demand is higher than ever. And the ability to transcend those traps is more readily available to all of these people than ever. And psychedelics have the capacity to actually allow us to upgrade our hardwire, to rewire our brains, to transcend our traumas, and to do even more than that, to transmute them from the lead of, darkness and pain and suffering and tragedy into the gold of higher consciousness and spiritual awareness and metacognition. And not a moment too soon. We are, and this is the way of the universe, everything contains its contradiction, and that includes moments. So there's this juxtaposition of opportunity and crisis. And this moment is more pregnant with both things, the potential for calamity and the potential for transcendence, than, very likely any other moment in human history. You would hope, so. I mean, there should be some sort of point to the evolutionary process. And we've all probably noticed at this point that there is a telescopic nature to the evolutionary paradigm, that the evolution of consciousness of the race moves faster and faster and faster. And with momentum comes power and magnitude and, the scale of the impact that can be created. And so, I don't know who said this, but whatever you're doing, you should not be bored. This is truly an exciting time. And, just for an example, as far as like the political stuff that's happening in the world, I checked out of that many, many years ago because I realized that the people that are running the show have got the scene locked down. They're totally in control of their puppets, and they're not going to let anyone near the White House that isn't completely under their control. They're puppets, or they're not allowed to play. And I think that it's extremely possible, although of course, could be wrong, but it's extremely possible that Kennedy has a vendetta because he believes that they killed his father, they killed his uncle, they killed 2 of his cousins. And he's older, and he just doesn't care, and he's willing to take them on. And I never would have seen that coming, and that's been like one of the big impediments that I've seen. Like, how can we possibly find a chink in or the missing scale in the armor of Smog to deliver the arrow that finally brings down Babylon, or at least renders it constrained to the will of the people as it's supposed to be. And maybe I'm being dramatic, but it certainly does seem at least possible that unexpected development has arrived. And so the point of it, I'm not necessarily trying to get you to support any political candidate. I'm just saying that even when it seems like you're absolutely doomed and there's no hope and no possibility, the most improbable shit that you could never have imagined will just all of a sudden happen. So even though we do seem hemmed in by the dominators, as Terence Mckenna would have said, it's always possible that some serendipitous, fortuitous, synchronistic, astronomically improbable development will come out of nowhere. And so it's like you have to put your foot in a space where there is no rock, and step, and then there's the rock. So, and also, I wanted to mention, you guys, that one of the themes of, the teachings of the mysteries and the traditions of shamanism and the Western occult tradition, and there are even some indications that support this in physics, although the extent to which, like the idea of the law of attraction or manifestation, to the extent to which that stuff is supported by physics at all is often exaggerated in popular culture, for sure. There's no doubt about that. But there have been recent experiments that show that even though it's probably not like the movie The Secret would have you believe, it's not exactly unreal either. And the more people, the more consciousness, it's basically just an electromagnetic influence, right? When you have a whole lot of consciousness focused on the same thing, it's an electromagnetic influence. And so if we can find a way to unify our thoughts and wills, then we can have an impact that supersedes what is directly explainable and observable. And I really hope that we can find that place of unity. And everyone knows there's great power there, but they won't let go of their wedge issues. They won't stop falling for the dominator trap of, fight about abortion, fight about race, fight about sexuality, fight about political parties, argue about all this shit. One of the things I've noticed is that in the last 10 or 20 years, 10 years even, there's actually more common ground for the left and the right to stand on than there ever has been before. There's so much more commonality, and yet they hate each other more than ever. And it's mostly because of wedge issues that actually only affect a very small percentage of the people on the fringes. That's the reality. And they have everyone completely obsessively fixated on these wedge issues to the extent that people don't realize that we really could just take our eyes off of that for a moment and resolve the greatest conflicts that humanity has ever confronted. One fell swoop. So thank you guys so much for spending this time with me. I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to go ahead and bugger off. But I appreciate each and every one of you, and please do hit the like button, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon. There are options to contribute a donation in the chat and in the description, and I'll see you again very soon, tomorrow, actually.